Good morning. Welcome to the Indiana MPO conference for 2021. My name is David Hiddle, and I am the Executive Director of the Area Plan Commission of Tippecanoe County, which includes the Lafayette MPO. You'll be seeing and hearing from the rest of our staff as well throughout the day, introducing our speakers as they come along. And then we'll also, this lunch period, be hosting a kind of a roundtable, a panel that we're titling Climate and the NTP, a practical conversation, wherein we'll have our staff kind of lead a discussion about practical implications for involving climate concerns in your MTP. Doug Pode will be leading that conversation, and we'll be trying to do the best we can because your input is going to be via text. So there'll be more on that later, but that'll be happening during the lunch hour. This is a single track conference. There are no breakouts, so you're either in or you're out, and there's no choices you have to make, which is nice. You can get to the agenda if you haven't already by going to the Indiana MPO conference page, and to get there, you would just Google Indiana MPO conference, click on the agenda button, and you can see the lineup for tonight, which is also right in front of you here. The recording, audio and video, will be made available. That will be on our county website on YouTube. The link we will send to you immediately after the conference via email, so that you'll have access to everything that happens here today. I don't think there's any other housekeeping or initial information to share. You know where your bathrooms are. You know how to get to whatever you need to do. So I think we'll just start right off with our first speaker, and to introduce him, we'll bring on hand Doug Pode, one of our senior transportation planners. Doug.
Good morning. Thank you, David. Gives me great pleasure. I'm excited to be or introduce our first speaker for the conference today. The presentation will be given by Erich Zimmerman, and the title of it is an update from Washington on transportation reauthorization and infrastructure spending. And just like to remind everyone who is listening in to submit questions and comments in writing via the chat feature during the course of the presentation, and then we can get to those and answer them. I'd like to introduce Erich, and here's his bio. Erich is the Director of Transportation Programs at the National Association of Regional Councils, or NARC. He is responsible for NARC's transportation portfolio, which includes managing priorities for NARC's members, lobbying for regional priorities on Capitol Hill, and carrying out a variety of programmatic, research, and communication initiatives. He helps refine policy priorities and recommendations for the Federal Surface Transportation Authorization, and also manages NARC's Transportation Technical Assistance and Education Program. Erich is also a member of the Transportation Resource Board's Metropolitan Policy, Planning, and Process Committee, well, that's a mouthful, which is ADA 20. Before joining NARC, Erich worked at the Taxpayers for Common Sense. Erich has a bachelor's in political communication from the George Washington University and a master's in environmental studies from the University of Montana. So it gives me great pleasure to present our first presenter, Erich. So Erich, please take it away.
Thanks for that kind introduction, and I'm certainly pleased to be joining you all here today to talk a little bit about what we see going on in Washington at the moment. Always sad when we can't be together in person, but I suppose this is the next best. Hopefully next year we'll be able to join you there in Indiana. I've spoken to you all several times before. I think times are a little headier now than they have been in the past. There's a lot more going on in Washington at the moment than there typically is, especially on transportation, but on a number of issues as well. So I'm going to talk you through some of those items as we go. So right now in Washington, we have a bit of what I'm calling Dysfunction Junction. And there is a lot that they're trying to accomplish at the moment, and a little that is actually getting accomplished, unfortunately. So first, and most importantly for our discussion today, they've got an infrastructure bill pending, which includes the transportation reauthorization. This is a $1.2 trillion investment in what they sort of refer to as hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, and the like. This bill, of course, as I'm sure everybody is well aware, has passed the Senate, but we're still waiting for a vote in the House. And as a result, we've now extended the FAST Act until October 31st. I'm sure folks caught wind this week that there was the potential or expectation for a vote yesterday. That simply didn't happen. And so we are looking at another extension of the program before the end of the month, before that October 31st date. We're hearing perhaps till the end of the year, but that's not yet been determined. At the same time, in sort of gumming up the infrastructure bill is the reconciliation bill. This started out as a $3.5 trillion or so investment in so-called soft infrastructure, sort of more human-based infrastructure. This has become coupled with the infrastructure bill, and we don't expect movement on infrastructure until reconciliation is also ready to move. Really, we're going to need the House, of course, passed a reconciliation bill, but it's going to have to be pared down pretty substantially. That's where the negotiations are now. Some of that has begun, and it's going to need to be around $1 trillion most likely in order to get past the Senate. So we await action on reconciliation in order to get to action on infrastructure, which simply needs to pass the House and can go to the president for signature. Also embroiled in this is government funding, which of course expired on September 30th, but was extended until early December. And then the debt ceiling, the sort of congressionally made crisis that comes up every once in a while, that also had come to the end of its useful life and had to be extended until December 3rd. It's unclear as to how action on that's going to proceed. So as you can see, there's a lot going on right now in Washington, but a lot of extensions happening and unfortunately not as much action as we would prefer to see. But we're here to talk about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, not the best acronym in Washington. I do prefer the Bipartisan Infrastructure Deal, which is another moniker that it's carried the bid. This was, of course, grows out of the American Jobs Plan, the administration's proposal from earlier in the year. This is originally endorsed, I think a lot of you know the outlines of this, originally endorsed by a number of senators, negotiated by sort of 10 moderates. And the total for this bill is about $1.2 trillion in total spending. About $550 billion of that is new spending, and we're going to get into some of that and how that breaks down. So this bill contains not only transportation reauthorization, but also water infrastructure reauthorization, and has funding for a broad number of other infrastructure areas, including power, electric vehicles, resiliency, airports, broadband, and on. So this is roughly how the bill's new spending breaks down. You can see it's almost exactly half of the new spending in the bill goes to transportation, and you get a relative sense of within that where the funding goes to different areas within that. Within transportation, a good size chunk goes to broadband, a good chunk goes to water, and then also significant funding to what they call the climate and energy bucket. This includes electric grid, a number of resiliency programs, remediation, cleanup of mines, things like that. So the bill is pretty expansive. It has a number of areas in it, well beyond transportation. I'm going to focus today primarily on transportation because you all are MPOs. I'm sure some of you dabble in some of the other things that are in the bill, but for purposes of today, I'm going to focus primarily on the transportation portion. So then what's in the bill for transportation? The bill has about $568 billion for the Department of Transportation, and that breaks down to about $351 billion for federal highways, $91 billion for federal transit. And as I mentioned, about half of the $550 billion in new spending actually goes to US DOT. This does include a full FAST Act reauthorization, a 5-year reauthorization with significant funding increases across basically all programs. You can get a little bit of a sense from the chart on the screen where those funding increases go, but you can see the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, sees a 24% increase to $72 billion. One of the notable ones is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program Set Aside, or otherwise known as the TAP program, Transportation Alternatives Program. I'll get into some of the details on this later, but this program sees a very substantial increase in funding, up to $7.2 billion a year, which is a 71% increase in funding. There's a substantial increase for planning as well, and you can see some of the other programs. I'm going to get into detail on some of these, but I thought it was good to see sort of where some of the increases are across the program. So what else is in the bill? Well, this bill has substantial investment in formula funding, of course, and even some new formula programs, but also a very significant number of discretionary grants, but also a very significant number of new discretionary grants. And that's what part of what I'm going to get into today. But the two formula programs are a carbon reduction program and the Protect program, which is for resiliency grants. I'm going to talk in some detail about those. Several new formula programs in some other areas as well, including in bridges, electric vehicle charging, and transit state of good repair. And then there are literally dozens of new discretionary programs within this bill, along with a number of new pilot programs, which are also basically discretionary in nature as well. Meaning, when I say discretionary, I mean distributed by the secretary. In other words, you or the communities that you represent will apply for these funds, and under the criteria established by USDOT will be approved for funding if your application is accepted, essentially. And so this is funding that will have to be pursued, as opposed to formula funding, which of course goes out to each state and in some cases each MPO for distribution. So it's quite a different world to be playing in with discretionary funds, but we'll talk a bit about that. So in total, there's 42 sections within this bill that impact or have some something to say or some involvement with MPOs and regional transportation planning organizations as well. And that is a large number. I can't really put it into perspective, but I can tell you it is vastly more than what we have seen in the past, largely because so many new programs were created in this bill. As mentioned, there are two new formula programs through the reauthorization section of the bill, several other new formula programs that come from funding in other parts of the bill. There are 11 new competitive grant programs in transportation and 7 new competitive pilot programs in transportation. So you can see there's going to be a lot of new areas to be focused in. To sort of give you a little bit of a sense of that, this is the set of discretionary grant funding that USDOT will be distributing just from the additional funding in the bill, not even really from the funding through reauthorization. So this bill contains many, many billions of what they call guaranteed appropriations, which is funding that is in the bill. It's guaranteed. It's going to be there, but it's not actually from Highway Trust Fund. It's from the general fund. So you can see just in those programs, there's $100 billion in discretionary grants that USDOT will be responsible for. Not all of them, of course, affecting or applicable to MPOs, but it shows you the enormous effort that is going to have to be undertaken by USDOT in the coming weeks and months, and really probably years, to roll this funding out and to figure out how they're going to distribute these funds down to the ground. So I do want to get into some detail today. We have the opportunity with a good amount of time. So I do want to talk through first some of the policy changes that this bill contains and that you can expect to see going forward. And then I'm going to walk through the two formula programs that I mentioned earlier in carbon and resiliency. And then I'm going to walk through just a sampling of the discretionary programs and the pilot programs, just to give you a little bit of a taste for how things are structured, what things you might be thinking about and looking for it in the future as those programs start to roll out from USDOT. So, of course, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program remains the single most important program within the bill, or within the transportation program for MPOs and for projects at the local level. Of course, we tried as we might to increase the sub-allocation level. That's the portion of the program guaranteed to go down to the local level. We thought we had a chance to do that. Unfortunately, because this became a Senate-only bill, essentially they accepted the Senate reauthorization bill instead of conferencing it with the House. The Senate left that sub-allocation level at 55%. So it remains at 55% in the bill. So we didn't lose ground, but we also unfortunately did not gain any ground. Also importantly, the program modifies the population bands that exist within this program. So as it is currently constructed, areas over 200,000 get ostensible control over how the funds are spent within their areas. And then from there, the state controlled the funds for the rest of the areas. So it was required to be spent in areas under 5,000 and then within areas of 5,000 to 200,000. But it kind of left out the fact that MPOs are formed at 50,000. And so what this provision will do is it will ensure that a proportional amount of funding has to be spent in areas of 50 to 200,000 as those areas represent within the broader population of the state. And I think that's a really important step forward. I think it does help ensure some parity for areas that are large enough to be deemed MPOs, but not large enough to be over the 200,000 mark, a transportation management area. It provides some surety that funds will be spent within their MPO and requires that the state, continue to consult with those areas as to what projects should be constructed with those funds. So I think this is a really important change and one that should have some significant benefits for some areas. The program also expands project eligibility. I won't get too much into the details on that. You can see that in my analysis or in some other places, but there will be some significant new ways in which you can spend your STP dollars as well. And then connected to surface transportation, of course, is the TAP program. As I mentioned earlier, not only does this program see a significant increase in funding, TAP funding is now basically attached to or determined by a 10% calculation off of STP. It doesn't take away from STP, but it's pegged at 10% of STP. So STP is at 72 billion. Therefore, TAP is going to receive $7.2 billion over the 5 years of the bill. This is, as I mentioned, not only a substantial increase in funding, there's a number of new policy changes as well. Previously, TAP was sub-allocated similar to STP, but at 50%. That now increases in this bill up to 59%. So a larger share of the funding will be provided by the state to areas by population. And again, those population bands in STP apply to TAP as well. So that should so those funds will be provided to population areas 50 to 200,000 and 200,000 and above. In addition, there's some provision where states may actually allocate 100% of its funding under TAP to its local areas if it chooses to, thereby basically completely localizing this program. So that's something that may be of interest. And then one of the weird things with this program over the years has always been that MPOs of 50 to 200,000 were not eligible recipients of TAP funds. That has now been modified so that MPOs of all size are now eligible recipients under TAP, which is a good improvement as well. Also important, of course, metropolitan planning. There's a few provisions in the planning section. Some of them are substantial. A couple of them are substantial. I would say there's not a lot of change in metropolitan planning, at least not through this section. I think there's some bigger changes through some of the programmatic work that will be coming. But it says when first designating officials, so when we believe this is going to apply when an MPO is first formed, they must consider the equitable and proportional representation of the population of the metropolitan planning area when designating officials on their board. We take this to mean, and we've been told this means geographic equitability and proportionality, but that will remain to be seen how US DOT and specifically FHWA chooses to implement this. So we will keep our eye on that. We will also keep our eye on the fact that this is meant to apply, we believe, to new MPOs, not to existing MPOs, but that will be something else that we will keep an eye on as they work through that process. Also requires consistency in planning data when there's more than one MPO within an urbanized area. This is at least getting at a little bit of the cleanup work that they tried to do with the planning rule a number of years ago. This applies to some of what they were trying to do there. Basically just saying that if you've got two MPOs within an urbanized area, they have to come together and make sure that the data they're using is consistent across both organizations within that urbanized area. It specifically allows states and MPOs to use social media and other web-based tools. Nice to see that they're so ahead of the game there. I'm sure many of you have been using these tools for a number of years in order to do public participation and receive public feedback, but it's now explicitly allowable under the law. And then very importantly, I think some of the bigger changes come in some requirements that were added after the Senate bill was passed, but in the negotiation over the final infrastructure bill, and that is requiring consultation in the metropolitan planning process with those that are involved in the provision of housing within a community. And then for TMAs for areas over 200,000, it makes allowable the integration of a housing plan into the metropolitan transportation plan, thereby working to try and bring together a little more closely the issues of housing and transportation, which I have recognized in my time in this position. The housing conversation really started to grow to the size of every room that we're in. It really became a huge focus for folks at all levels, whether, even within the MPO context, trying to find ways to help their communities deal with some of the housing issues. I think this makes it a little more explicit that is allowable, that is actually encouraged, and will be part of the planning process going forward. Under CMAQ, there's a number of new eligibilities for micromobility, heavy-duty zero-emission vehicles. Also, I think perhaps the most important change is that it allows CMAQ funds to be used for operating assistance for public transportation projects. And in rural areas and areas under 200,000 in population, there's no time limit anymore. I think there used to be maybe 5 years. There's under current law, there was a limit on the number of years you could use CMAQ funds for operating assistance. That is no longer the case. You'll be able to do that indefinitely. So that's a fairly big change there. A new section in the bill, increasing safe and accessible transportation options. This is extremely important because even with the significant increase I demonstrated earlier to transportation planning, in this section, they take 2.5% of your overall planning funds, and now that will be required to be used to carry out one or more activities that, quote, increase safe and accessible options for multiple travel modes for people of all ages and abilities. And so the types of activities that includes are complete streets, active transportation plans, other types of planning to consider alternatives to highway capacity, development of plans to support transit-oriented development. And you can actually petition out of spending your 2.5% of funds in these areas if you can demonstrate you have both a complete street standard and prioritization plan in place. Then you can petition the secretary not to spend your 2.5% on these activities. But otherwise, you're going to have to start spending at least 2.5%. Now, I think in many areas, this probably won't have an enormous impact. Probably 2.5% goes there anyway. But if you're not spending 2.5%, be aware that there will be a shift in how you spend some of your transportation planning funding. And I will note this also applies to the state. So states will have to provide 2.5% of their SPR funds, their state planning and research funds, to these purposes as well. All right, so that's some of the policy that I think is most relevant. So now let's take a little dive into some of the program areas. This is the fun stuff. This is where the money comes. This is where the projects happen. And so this is, I just wanted to give folks a little bit of a flavor, like I said, for some of what you can expect coming down the road. So the first new formula program is extremely relevant for MPOs and for local projects. This is a new formula program, so every state will receive a portion of these funds from this bill, and it's basically a program to reduce transportation emissions broadly. So importantly, 65% of the funds that go to each state are now to be sub-allocated to areas within the state by population, identical to the way that SDBGP funds are distributed. So there will be a majority of these funds will be going through the MPO process in order to support projects that reduce transportation emissions. There's lots of eligibilities, as you can imagine, including public transportation, bike ped, ITS, congestion pricing. So you'll have a wide variety of options to look at. And then within each state, and in consultation with any MPOs within the state, they have 2 years to develop a carbon reduction strategy, and that they also must consult with an RTPO when obligating funds for projects in rural areas. So the state has a couple requirements here as well. Obviously, that carbon reduction strategy plan is going to be a big deal, and certainly something where MPOs are going to want to weigh in and have a large voice in the development of that product, because so much of this funding is coming to the MPOs. So the funding for this program is $6.4 billion over 5 years. So somewhere in the vicinity of $1.2 billion each year. As mentioned, every state will get some portion of that, and then down to the MPOs. So the other formula program is the PROTECT program. I did not write the acronym out, and I will be honest, I do not remember it. It's very long, but it's basically a resilience improvement program. And this one is interesting because it contains both a formula component and competitive grants within it. So the $7.3 billion will go out over 5 years, so about $1.4 billion per year will go out by formula. That goes primarily to the state, though there is 2% of that set aside for planning. So some of that may make it down and should make it down to MPOs for resilience planning. In addition, there is $1.4 billion for competitive grants, and I'll get in a second what those competitive grants are. There's a number of them. So the types of eligible projects under this program are things like preparing for storm surge, flood protection, aquatic ecosystem restoration, so culverts, things like that. So anything regarding the resilience of your system, areas that are vulnerable to inundation in a storm, or flooding or things like that. These are the types of projects that are going to come under this program. Now, as I mentioned, there are several different competitive grants under this. You can, as an MPO, you're eligible to apply for resilience planning grants, as well resilience improvement grants separately. So you can do the planning with one grant and then get a second grant to actually implement the improvements that you've established are necessary in that planning grant. There's a community resilience and evacuation route grant program. If you are in an area that has that type of activity, you have, especially on the coast, I can imagine with hurricanes, things like that, where you've got evacuation routes that are necessary. I'm sure there will be other eligibilities there as well. And then the final one is at-risk coastal infrastructure grants. As far as I know, Indiana is not yet coastal, though who knows what the future holds. So keep your eye on that one. But perhaps that will also apply to the Great Lakes, would not surprise me. So there may be actually some applicability of those grants. The federal share on this program is 80%. They get a little creative here, which is why I'm pointing this out. The federal share starts at 80% and can be increased through activities at the state and MPO level. First, you can increase the federal share by 7% if the state and/or MPO has a resilience improvement plan and has prioritized the funded program within that plan. So that would increase the potential federal share up by 7%, and then it can go up another 3% if the MPO in question that's applying for a grant has incorporated its resilience plan into its metropolitan transportation plan. So the resilience plan is not required, but you are being induced to do a resilience plan and then incorporate that resilience plan into your metropolitan transportation plan, and that will earn you another 3% in federal share. So you could get as high as 90%. It's only 10% local share required on these projects if you qualify under that. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the competitive programs. Give me just one moment. I need a little drink of water. So first, National Infrastructure Project Assistance Grants. This is a new competitive grant program supporting freight-related projects. This receives $10 billion a year. And as you can see, 50% of these funds are for projects between 100 and 500 million, and then 50% for projects over 500 million. So these are mega projects. These are projects that otherwise might be hard to fund and support through typical, year-to-year authorizations through the program. Now can get funds under this for that purpose. The SMART program, Strengthening Mobility and Revolutionizing Transportation. Think Smart Cities Challenge. If any of you apply for that funding, this is basically a way to democratize that program, make it more widely available for demonstration projects for advanced smart city initiatives. $500 million for that program over the 5 years of the bill. I'll go into significantly more detail on that program in just a minute. The Rural Surface Transportation Grant Program. This is to improve and expand surface transportation in rural areas, but I will note rural in this context defined as areas with population, it says over 200,000. That's meant to be under 200,000. So rural in this case is any area with population under 200,000. So that will apply to a great number of areas that maybe don't even consider themselves rural, but would be able to apply for these funds. There's a Safe Street and Roads for All program. This is a Vision Zero based program. Requires a comprehensive safety action plan, which I won't get too much into the details on that. I may actually give some more details later, but that has about $1 billion over 5 years. All right, so let's go a little bit into detail. I think it's just helpful. I'm only going to do this with a sampling of the programs because there's so many of them, there would not possibly be time to do them all. But talking through a little bit on the SMART program, just to give you a little bit of a flavor for how they're sort of approaching some of these things and what you can be expecting in the future. You can see the funding, as I mentioned, $500 million over 5 years, so $100 million a year. 40% of that will go to larger communities over 400,000. 30% will go to areas under 50,000, and then 30% to areas of 50 to 400,000. So they're trying to require, build in some equity in the funding across geographic areas. MPOs are eligible as are public transit agencies. There's also an allowance for regional partnerships, which is comprised of 2+ eligible entities in jurisdictions with a combined population of over 400,000. You can apply, would then be able to apply together for a grant under this program. Eligible uses include both development phase, so the planning, and the construction phase activities of a project. So you can both plan and build. There are admittedly extensive reporting requirements. Obviously, the Secretary's office is interested in learning more about some of these innovations and figuring out how they might integrate them more broadly across the country, or figure out what things work and what don't work in this context. You can see what the project should consist of, like what the focus of these are, whether it's coordinated automation, connected vehicles, smart technology, traffic signals. There's kind of a whole host of things that fall under the program that can be funded with these funds. And just a little bit about some of the selection criteria they outline. You can see it's, the extent of your public transit system, your population density, the commitment of your leadership and your capacity for some of these projects, open data commitment, and then the likelihood of success as established by the Secretary, obviously. And then you can see the selection criteria include the extent to which the project you're proposing has an impact on this long list of things, from congestion reduction, modal connectivity, pollution reduction. So a pretty wide range of activities. But the more of these that your project touches on, the better chance you're going to have, obviously, getting funding through a program such as this. And then finally, there's prioritization already written into the legislation given to projects that would be scalable, that encourage data sharing, encourage innovation, obviously, and some of the other things that you can read on the screen. I won't read them all off, but this is really where this program is going, because they want to take things that they find through this program that they have funded with some of these funds and make them applicable more broadly, and perhaps they're the kinds of individual things that might show up in future reauthorization bills. But it's an opportunity to fund some innovations that there was nowhere to fund them previously. And then a second program I'll go through in a little bit more detail is this Safe Streets and Roads for All program. This is the Vision Zero program I mentioned earlier. This has $1 billion in funding over 5 years. Again, this is another competitive grant program. So it does require the development of a comprehensive safety action plan, which is aimed at preventing fatalities and serious injuries. Elements include goals, analysis of current crash locations, a data-driven approach to identify projects, and then mechanisms for evaluating outcomes. MPOs are eligible, and the federal share is 80%, and then requires regular reporting to the secretary and a final report indicating how the projects, how well the funds helped achieve the ends that you were seeking to achieve. Strangely, the way that this program is laid out, a full 40% of the funds have to be spent on the development of those comprehensive plans. So there's going to be significant funding available specifically for that purpose. And then the other activities that are then eligible with some of the other 60% of the funding would be for planning, design, and development, and then carrying out the actual projects or strategic approaches themselves. And then you can see there's a number, again, you can see Congress is I think, and this is one of the reasons I'm going through these in a little bit of detail. You can see that within this bill, a progression in how prescriptive Congress is being in the development of these programs. There are a lot of very specific elements already outlined by Congress within these. I mean, they've done that in the past. I think perhaps it's another increase in that in this bill, where they really lay out 7 areas where that US DOT is expected to consider when choosing projects. Now, that doesn't take away all of the decision making of the secretary. At the end of the day, they kind of have the authority to do what they want, but you can see Congress is at least attempting to keep some of that control and say, here's how you should be selecting these projects. But you can see that projects are going to be evaluated based on these 7 criteria. Evidence-based strategies, demonstrating engagement with the public and private stakeholders, but you can see there's a pretty wide range of activities there. And then a third program, the Active Transportation Infrastructure Investment Program. This is a new competitive grants for safe and connected activities for transportation facilities in an active transportation network or active transportation spine. So unlike TAP funding, which I think often goes toward sort of on-road, perhaps more urban context bike lanes. This is more for bike routes, urban or otherwise, but for sort of maybe longer-term trail systems, connected trail systems, things like that. So that's your active transportation spine. So the funding for this is $1 billion over 5 years. There's also $3 million a year set aside for planning and design grants within this. 30% of the funding goes to projects to construct active transportation networks, and then 30% to projects to construct active transportation spines. So that more sort of trail network idea. Federal share is 80%, but can be increased to 100% in areas with over 40% poverty. Eligible entities include both MPOs and RTPOs, and eligible projects are basically active transportation projects that are regional in nature and that cost more than $15 million. So again, that gets toward these sort of more systemic type projects, not a single bike lane on a single street, but more getting into sort of longer term, maybe call them commuting trails or even recreational trails that are larger in nature. All right, so now let's talk through just a few of the pilot programs. I know this is a lot of information. I am sure you'll get these slides into your hands and you'll have some more of the detail. I'll also point you toward my analysis of this, which has similar and even probably more detail than what you'll find here. But a few of the pilot programs, a national motor vehicle per mile user fee pilot. This is a pilot that will provide funding to test at a national level the idea of a mileage-based user fee or a per mile charge, because obviously, as we all know, the gas tax is on its way out. It's not going to be sustained. It's already not sustainable, will not be sustainable in the long term. And so this is an effort to explore an option to replace it through this per mileage user fee concept. There's a prioritization process pilot program. This is one where there will be funding available on a pilot basis for scoring projects on some specific criteria, and then using that scoring to choose projects for your metropolitan plan. And so this is an MPO specific provision, and one that will, the idea is to help you develop metrics upon which projects are chosen in an effort, I believe, to take this away from a more political consideration and make it a more data-driven process. Next up is the Reconnecting Communities pilot program. This gets very significant funding, $500 billion total for this. This is the program where you can apply for funds to either plan for or actually do the process of removing or modifying transportation infrastructure within your community that divides the community in some way. So highways running through Central City, for example, or I'm sure there are many, many other examples that folks have of these types of facilities. This is an opportunity to get funds to consider their removal or actually go ahead and start removing, or as I said, modifying those facilities. There's a transportation access pilot program. This is another heavily data-driven provision whereby an accessibility data set would be provided to the MPO to take a look at and consider transportation access within the context of their transportation planning in an effort to eventually, I believe, develop some kind of transportation access measure that would be part of the performance measure program. But this is a way to test out getting the data that would be required in order to do that transportation access analysis. And then finally, a pilot program in wildland crossing safety, reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, improve habitat connectivity. 60% of the funds has to go to rural areas, $350 million in this program. It is MPO eligible. I'm not sure how many MPOs are going to go after this funding. I'm actually very curious to see, because it's certainly not an issue I've ever heard MPOs discuss, but I'm sure in some areas it is an issue that they will applaud having some funding to go after to try and deal with that. So that is an interesting one, and we'll see how that one plays out. So that's it for the programs. I know that was a lot of information. I hope I didn't lose anybody there, or I did. Hopefully people went and got some coffee and perked themselves back up. I just want to stress that what I just provided to you is a bare sampling of what's in this bill. As I said, my analysis contains a ton more data, a ton more specificity as to what's in here. And then obviously this is going to play out through a process through USDOT, and we're going to have way more detail again to deal with as they go through that process. So be prepared that there is a lot that's going to be coming your way. I think one of the bigger challenges is going to be for you is going to be identifying what pots of funding you or your communities might apply for, and then secondarily having the capacity and ability to actually apply for and compete for those funds without killing your ability to do the other important things that you do on any given day. So that's going to be a real challenge. USDOT, I know, is aware of the significant challenge that this bill raises in that context, and we're going to continue to work with them to make sure that areas have the type of technical assistance that they need in order to apply, that we're ensuring that organizations of all sizes and capacity have a chance to compete. But that's really going to be the challenge for me, I think for many of you, for DOT over the next year, maybe a couple of years. So transitioning, I can never leave without talking a little bit about the trust fund. You would think with all this big, beautiful new spending that they must have found some pot of gold somewhere that's going to solve the highway trust fund. They did find a pot of gold. It is certainly not going to solve the Highway Trust Fund. Simply transfer, this bill simply transfers $118 billion from the general fund into the Highway Trust Fund. This is how they've been dealing with the shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund for a number of years now. As we all know, the gas tax is no longer sufficient in any way, shape, or form to keep up with the spending that's needed to support our system. So there's a significant and growing gap between gas tax receipts and spending levels. In this case, it required, as I said, $118 billion transfer to make up the gap there. $90 billion of that will go to the highway account, $28 billion to the transit account. And that brings the total of transfers from general fund to highway trust fund since 2008, when they first started transferring, to $270 billion. So we're starting to get to a real number here. It's a lot of cheese that they've had to transfer. And frankly, this bill does basically nothing for highway trust fund solvency beyond the 5 years. Of course, it keeps it solvent for these 5 years, but it really does nothing to help solve this problem going forward. And in fact, it makes the cliff that much worse, because now the spending levels are all higher and will be higher going into the future. And gas tax receipts continue to decline because of efficiency and other factors. And so really in the future, you could imagine if they take this path, the next transfer could be $150 billion or even potentially more than that in order to support the next bill. The one thing it does contain, as I mentioned, is that mileage-based user fee study, but that's a study, very much unclear as to whether or not this is going to be some kind of solution going forward for the gas tax. So, it certainly, a transfer of this magnitude is much better than any alternative of cutting the program to match gas tax receipts or anything like that. That would be a tenable solution. But I do think this is something that continues to require our attention, simply because the program is better when we have some sure set of funding. We know how much is coming in. We know how much is going to be spent, even looking into the future. And right now, we just do not have that surety, and we'll continue not to have that beyond the 5 years of this bill. So then what's next? I'm hopeful for final passage. It looked for a hot minute like they were thinking about potentially getting there, but obviously that's not likely to happen this week. I said October 30th, it's actually the 31st. So we're not going to get that final passage. So we're going to get an extension. The question is for how long. I'm a little disappointed if they do it through the end of the year, simply because keeping the pressure on is always better. So a deadline is always some small help in getting Congress to act. But it does seem like they might go through the end of the year. But I still think final passage of this at some point, probably later in the year. I wouldn't even be surprised if it's in the second half of December. It does still seem very, very likely to me. I really, they've got this thing teed up. It's sitting for them there on a platter. All it has to do is pass the House and the president can sign it. I think it's much more likely than not that they still get to this bill and they do get it passed. In the case that that does happen, as mentioned, there's going to be lots and lots of rulemaking, lots and lots of program writing, and eventually lots of money going. There's a ton of funding, as I tried to demonstrate, for a number of areas. If it doesn't pass, which, as I said, I think is less likely, but if it doesn't pass, you are certainly going to hear a lot of belly aching, because this thing was right there for them to take. We're going to certainly see program extensions beyond whatever they do for this next extension. And really, then the future for reauthorization becomes much less certain. Of course, the bill could carry over till next year, but you can't really pull this out and have it go on its own, because they didn't negotiate anything with the House. And so suddenly then Mr. DeFazio would want his say with this bill, and would want to conference this in some way before going to final passage. So we could then be looking at a scenario where we're pushing this way down the road. This could be potentially years of extension. So I don't want to leave you with that depressing note. I am here today to be a bit more optimistic than that. I do think this is going to pass, but I do need to prepare you for the reality in case it doesn't, that it could be sort of a little doom and gloom for reauthorization for a while, with extensions for a bit. So that is all I have. I hope folks have some questions, but you can find a full analysis, probably more than you would ever want to know, at our website, narc.org. It's right there on the front page. I have both sort of a summary document, which gets into all of the provisions that are MPO related. And then if you really want to geek out, I have an even bigger document that has all of the transportation provisions, whether MPO related or not. And you can see sort of a breakdown of everything that's in the bill for states, tribal, otherwise, if you really want to get in deep into the details there. So thank you very much, and I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Erich, very much for that level, that depth of analysis and detail. I think that's very much appreciated. So we'll open it up for questions. If anybody has anything, please type it into the chat feature, and we'll read those as they come. I did have one, and this is maybe a naive question, or maybe it's loaded, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. The national per mile user fee. I mean, that's on a theoretical level, that's really a compelling thing, because it shifts the burden of cost, to some degree, to proportionally to the parties that use the roads. And what's your sense of a legitimate future for a per mile user fee or something of the sort?
So my feeling has long been, because this is being studied, and a number of states have actually implemented pilots of their own. Utah has an active program, Oregon, Virginia has either kicked off or is about to kick off a pilot. And I've sort of long felt that this is probably going to play out at the state level first, because, for the same reason that all 50, or it wasn't 50 states at the time, but all states had a gas tax before a federal gas tax came in. I kind of felt that all states would have some kind of a VMT before it became federalized. But I'm getting the sense recently that, in fact, there may be the possibility of doing it at the federal level, and sort of not having it necessarily have to be in place within the states. But it's pretty complicated at the federal level. It's just such a nitty-gritty way to collect funds. The expenses are potentially a barrier. The cost of just collecting the funds right now, as I'm sure most folks realize, we don't even collect it at the gas pump. It's collected at the refinery level, and so you're really only collecting from a few entities. Now suddenly you're going to collecting from 100 million entities or something in that range. So it just becomes a lot more. It gets very complicated very quickly. The costs go up very, very quickly. So I mean, I certainly don't want to talk myself out of the fact that it could happen. But I think there's a lot, we're going to need to see a lot of challenges overcome, not to mention some of the philosophical questions that will certainly arise of, is my car spying on me type of stuff, which I think can be overcome. But I think just even the nuts and bolts of doing it, I think could potentially be challenging. So we'll see. I think the fact that they provided funding is really good. I think we absolutely need to get a bit of a sense of how this could play out, what it could look like at the federal level. And I think that'll start to answer a lot of the questions about, is this even feasible at the federal level?
Great, thanks, Erich.